Hi, I'm Chuck Dorsett for Weaver Leather Supply, and this is the Leather Element. If you've got a good question for us, or you've got a good idea for a leather element, drop it in the comment box below. We get a lot of questions from folks who are new to leathercraft asking about the proper order of steps in any given project. Well, it can be confusing. No, we're going to cut through that. For chrome tans, we've got about 4 basic steps. In veg tan, about 5 basic steps. But we can add all kinds of steps to the veg tan. And in fact, that's why it's my favorite leather. So I'm going to step to the back of my table. Let's see if I can help. Chrome tans are basically our garment and upholstery leathers. They're usually lighter weight, typically supple, but almost always gorgeous colors, prints, and textures. Now the tannery's already taken care of this for us. So when we get a chrome tan, it's already dyed, it's already got a top coat or a finish on it. So it's ready to go. Unlike a veg tan, and we'll talk about that. But let's talk about our 4 basic steps, then we'll discuss each for just a little bit. So right off the bat, obviously, we're going to cut out our pattern. Second and third steps, these are a little bit interchangeable, and I'll describe that. Step 4, final assembly. Now, step 4, final assembly. We're going to add buckles or billets or straps. We're just finishing the project out. Everything is done. Now let's back up. Steps 2 and 3. I said these are a little bit interchangeable. Well, they are, and this will make perfect sense. So we're going to decorate, and then we're going to sew. With our decoration, we typically are going to punch our holes, say we're going to lay in a concho or a braid, because sometimes, say we've got a pocket. Well, we need to lay in spots or braids before we sew that pocket onto the main panel. So basically, those are interchangeable, but a little upfront planning, and we can figure that out easily. Okay, we've got a feel for chrome tans. Now let's step over, because with our veg tan, we've got 5 basic steps. Let's do the same thing. Let's look at our steps, then we'll talk about them briefly. So obviously, like everything, we're going to start with cutting our veg tan. Second step, let's punch our holes, and we'll talk about this. Third, let's take care of our edges. Fourth, we're going to dye and top coat. And 5, final assembly. Again, this is where everything comes together. Now, I tend to like to cut my project up front. First off, I make sure I have enough leather. That's happened more times than I care to admit. But secondly, I don't get halfway through the project, feel like now I have to back up, start over on my straps or whatever. Let's just take that out of the equation. Let's cut our project up front. Now, punching. We punch with the chromes, but with the veg tan, it just seems a little bit more prominent because we're doing a lot of belts and straps and billets. So let's take care of our round holes, our oblongs, round end, and English point. Next step, with our edge work. Now, I'm a big proponent of edge work because if you've ever seen 2 projects side by side, one with edge work and one without, the one without looks incredibly unfinished. We've got a great video on taking care of your edges. Now let's dye and top coat. Everything is taken care of. So let's drop in our dye, our top coat, and then final assembly. Everything comes together. Okay, we've got a good feel for the 5 basic steps. Now let's mix it up a little bit, because now we're going to talk about some stamping, tooling, maybe adding an antique, all kinds of ways we can go with a veg tan. Now, the tannery has basically said, we're going to tan this leather up to this point. From there, it's up to you. Okay, we'll take that ball and run with it, because now we have so many possibilities. Okay, our first 2 steps, we're going to cut, obviously, but our second step now, let's do some tooling, or if we're going to stamp, maybe some initials or someone's name into a belt. Let's do that now, wet forming as well, because we're going to have some dry time. So let's set those panels or pieces aside. We can work on the balance of the project. Now, the next 3 steps, these are going to fall into place and they're going to make perfect sense. So we're going to trim to size. We're going to punch our holes, in punches, round holes. Let's take care of our edge work. And then last thing before dye, let's drop in our chisel line. Now let's back up. When I say trim to final size, here's why. So if we're wet forming or wet molding, we're going to use a larger piece than we actually need so we can work the leather onto the mold. So we need to trim that to size. Now with tooling or stamping, that's going to increase the size of the panel. We're literally pushing that leather out. Now there's ways to keep that from happening, but I tend to tool and then trim to size. So basically when I say trim to size, we're trimming back to our pattern measurements. Now our edge work, easy enough. Chisel, if we're going to hand sew, that's going to be beautiful because that's going to fall in after our edge work where we add our groove. And to our next step, dye and top coat. Now there are all kinds of options between die and top coat. We can add an antique, and there are all kinds of color possibilities here. In fact, an antique is going to show off our tooling or our stamping, and the natural range marks and blemishes in the leather, those are going to pick up a little bit of that antique too. Make it absolutely beautiful, look used and loved. Now, before we get to top coat, we could always go with some paint. We could always do a two-tone dye. So I'll dye the entire body in brown, and then I can paint the black dye in. All kinds of possibilities here. So last step, final assembly. Let's knock this project together. All right, so we've got a feel. Now, again, a lot of these steps are interchangeable, but let's just keep in mind what needs to be done before we dye and what needs to be done after we dye. Let's step over to our pattern table because I've got one easy trick that's going to help us out when we're planning a project. There are two easy tricks that always help me out when I'm planning a project. First off, I can always write down my 5 basic steps, leave a little room in between each, so when I add a design or technique or decoration, I can drop that in where it makes the most sense. Now here's a good example. Say we want to line a project. If you're new to leather, we're simply gluing 2 pieces of leather together. There's a number of reasons we would do that. If I want that liner dyed, then I'm going to drop that in up here. But if I want to add a different kind of leather, I want to dye my outside, add a different type of leather for my liner, now I'm going to drop this in after dye. But also, we're probably going to have to punch some holes again. This is part of the fun to me of planning a project, getting every step in just the right order. Because here's the point. We're just trying to keep steps from interfering with other steps. That's all we're looking for. And that's exactly right. If we can get that to happen, our project is going to come out just like we envision it. I hope that's the case with every project you work on. Thanks for taking time to watch The Leather Element. Good luck with your projects.